Bjorn, but doesn't this really prove a point, okay? I mean, I know you advocate how we should deal with the situation. It doesn't really matter how we got here. It's how to deal with it. Is that your philosophy in dealing with climate change?
Well, of course, it does matter how we got here, because if global warming is entirely fraudulent, then clearly we shouldn't be trying to cut carbon emissions. But I think, honestly, we've got to look at the vast number of scientists. Now, I've met a lot of these guys. They're not bad guys.
Yeah,
they're actually
in the
trying
pay,
to look
Bjorn. They're
into...
in the pay of the
Sorry.
No, Bjorn, I want you to keep going. Go ahead.
Yes, they're fundamentally trying to look at what does the data tell them. Sure, and I think also Michael might be a little more forthcoming in saying the East Anglia emails, they were disconcerting. There were attempts to delete data and not share data and trying to influence the peer review process. Some of it is true that happens in all policy, but it was a little exaggerated. So I think we need to give the argument of saying, yes, the IPCC has become, to a certain extent, somewhat politicized, very, very clearly exemplified by the head, the Pachauri, who very clearly gives advice, contrary to what the IPCC own statute says, that they should be policy neutral. But fundamentally, let's get back to it and say, yes, CO2 does increase warming. That's what even very skeptical scientists like Dick Litson and Pat Michaels is telling us.
No, it does not.
All right, go ahead, Piers. Go ahead, Piers.
Well, Bjorn, look, please. CO2 is now increasing and world temperatures are going down. So it's not driving it, okay? That's a fact. If you want to know why, it's because there are many feedback processes and a whole lot of other things. And concerning Dr. Pachauri, I think the chair of IPCC, I think you should know, he's also Director Energy of the Director General of the Tata Energy Research Institute, which is funded by Tata, the giant steel operation, which closed the site in Redcar in England in order to make billions out of carbon trading. So he is directly involved in money making and losing of jobs in Britain.
Okay, Piers, I'd like to go.
That runs
Piers, we're getting close to the break. I'd like Michael to respond, then we'll go to the break.
It's a thieves' kitchen going on there, and it has to
Michael,
be closed down.
Michael in Washington, go right ahead. You can respond before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Well, what I would say is all the scientists agree that CO2 is not the only thing affecting the climate. Of course the sun affects the climate. So do volcanoes. So do a whole bunch of other things. And so what you have to look at is how all of them look together.
All right, gentlemen. All right, gentlemen, we're going to go. We're going to go to a short break, and we'll continue our discussion on climate change. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about whether a consensus is possible at the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference. But before we continue, let's have a look at Russia's position in the issue.
Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has recently called on the world's leading economies to join efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions. He also pointed out that there should be a differentiated approach to the commitments of developed and developing countries. While the climate talks in Copenhagen are underway, Russia has promised to reduce its carbon emissions by 25% from 1990 levels by the year 2020. And what do Russians think about climate change? According to an opinion poll, almost half of Russians believe in the threat of global warming. They say there are no defined seasons anymore, no real winter or summer. 33% said they don't believe in the threat, considering it to be a conspiracy theory or a normal cyclical process. Another 18% gave no answer. Asked a different question about reasons for climate change, 57% of Russians think it's the result of human activity. 30% say it's a natural phenomenon that there are times when the Earth warms and cools. Another 4% said the climate doesn't change at all. And 7% didn't answer the question. Peter?
Thank you for that, Yelena. Bjorn, if I can go to you first. We've listened to science on this program here, and there's a lot of conflicting opinions based on different facts or whatever. But it's politicians that decide, and they have to listen to scientists. Scientists don't have to listen to voters, but politicians do. Has this been over-politicized? I mean, a lot of leaders are going to Copenhagen to score some points, but is it going to be long-term? And are we going to get some kind of agreement in the long term about climate change?
Well, I'm actually standing right here where they're going to be making the decision on Friday, hopefully when all the 115 leaders, as it's right now counted, are going to gather and try to work out a successor for Kyoto. What is very clear is that everybody comes, and you also just heard the Russian president saying, we're going to cut carbon emissions. We're going to pledge to cut carbon emissions by 2020 by some percent. Many, and you could also argue the Russians, are perhaps not very ambitious, but they are all very nice-sounding promises. My problem with this is essentially that it is great politics. It makes for you to be able to say, I'm going to save the world, and it sounds really good. But of course, none of them are actually going to keep it. And how do we know? Because we've tried this for 18 years, and they haven't kept it in the past. They didn't keep their promise in 1992 in Rio. They didn't keep their even greater promise in 1997 in Kyoto. And so coming to Copenhagen, making these grand promises, sound a little hollow.
Okay, Michael, going back to the politicians here, I mean, as Bjorn pointed out, all of these agreements and goals, the politicians that are in office right now probably will not be there. I mean, isn't this where politics and science really collide? Reliability, commitment, long term.
Well, I think the 1992 commitment was a voluntary one. It basically didn't work, which is why they basically started working toward Kyoto, which was going to have some effect. The U.S. withdraw, probably because, I think, because we have a large growing population and the commitment to do it was very difficult. But when there are rules passed in the U.S., the courts tend to enforce them. And what we need is the U.S. basically taking the lead in some sense to demonstrate that it can be done. And we can do it. We can make our buildings much more efficient. We can electrify the transportation system. We can get our electricity from renewable and nuclear and other sources. I mean, there are ways to do this. We just have to take a first step, and there's a lot, and we need that incentive to take that jump.